Right, I think let's make a start. Hello and welcome to the British Academy event, Confronting COVID-19, Nudge and Sludge. I'm Hetan Shah, I'm Chief Executive of the British Academy. We are the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, and we play three roles. We're a fellowship of world-leading scholars, one of whom I'll be talking to in a moment. We're a funding body supporting research, new research internationally and nationally. And we're a forum for debate on the big issues of the day. And today's event stems from a recognition that the global pandemic that we're facing is not just a medical issue, but has economic, social, and cultural effects, and that a range of disciplines beyond medical insights will be valuable, including law, psychology, economics, and history. And so the Academy has put together a program of work called Shape the Future, where we're bringing together our fellows and others to provide just that kind of insight into how we respond to the pandemic. And today, we've got a wonderful speaker to help shine a light on a behavioural psychology and economics perspective on exactly this. So I'd like to welcome Professor Cass Sunstein, who has an enormous biography. So let me just take you through some of the highlights. Cass is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School. He's the co-author with Professor Richard Thaler of the book Nudge. He's former senior advisor to President Obama and the winner of the 2018 Holberg Prize, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and Humanities. And he's a fellow of the British Academy. And his forthcoming book, Too Much Information, will be released this autumn. So Cass, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks to you. Pleasure to be here.
And in terms of the format, Cass and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking some audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit it using the Q&A button on your dashboard. And do also feel free to tweet if you're so minded, and copy in our Twitter hashtag, our handle, at British Academy _. Both Cass and I are also on Twitter. So let's kick off. Cass, for those who in the audience today who may be a bit less familiar with the concept of nudge, can you say a little bit more to explain it, especially in the context of COVID-19?
Great. So the basic idea is that sometimes it's helpful to have an intervention that preserves freedom of choice, but that helps us get where we want to go. So a GPS device is a nudge, a reminder saying, for example, there's an event starting at a certain time, given 5 minutes in advance, that's a nudge. Something saying a bill is due or you have a doctor's appointment, that's a nudge. A warning is definitely a nudge. A bit of information, say about calories connected with your lunch, that's a nudge. If you're automatically enrolled in a program, it might be a pension program, it might be some other program that your employer just puts you in, but you can get out if you want to. Those things are nudges. Reminders of social norms are nudges. So if the norm is mask wearing, you're told that's a nudge. So the idea is these are interventions that preserve freedom of choice, and that's crucial. People can go their own way if they don't like what the GPS suggests, but they do a little steering of people in a direction which we hope is going to be good for them. And if it isn't, then we should change it. There's nudging all over the world right now in connection with COVID-19. In fact, this has been a worldwide effort. There might be a nudge to wear a mask, which involves something like a clear communication that says, wear a mask, the life you save may be your own. Or wear a mask, the life you save may be your elderly neighbors. That's a nudge. These things in stores now all over the world, which show the 2 meters or the 1.5 meter distance people should maintain. That might be on the floor of a store. That's emphatically a nudge. New Zealand maybe wins Olympic gold. New Zealand, I don't think, wins a lot of Olympic gold, but they might win Olympic gold for nudging 2020. It's not all they're doing, but they've done a ton of things, including nudges that say such things as united, which is signaling a social norm, and be kind, which is a very simple way of saying treat others with respect, but also don't get other people sick.
So this must have been a fascinating time to see different governments using behavioral insights in different ways. I mean, can you share your thoughts about how different countries have incorporated social science and behavioral insight alongside medical or more traditional scientific advice in responding to the pandemic?
Yes, so thank you for that. There's a shared understanding in diverse countries that our species, Homo sapiens, has many incredibly impressive attributes compared to Neanderthals and Homo erectus who went extinct. We have some really good attributes, but we have some things that can get us into trouble. For example, we tend to be present biased. That is, today and tomorrow really matter. The long term, maybe not so much. We tend to be unrealistically optimistic, which can be a good thing. We tend to be overconfident. And many governments have people, sometimes really at the top, who are aware of these, let's say, imperfections, and they've taken steps to try to counteract them. And I think that in Australia and New Zealand, both of which have flourishing behavioral science communities, including people in the government, to try to counteract unrealistic optimism by signaling the seriousness of the threat has been a prime idea. Another idea in behavioral science is if you want people to do something, kind of the first thing to do is make it easy rather than kind of shoving them or pushing them, figuring out why aren't they doing it anyway and removing the obstacle. So it may be a simple obstacle like you can't find a mask, or if you're staying at home, the economic situation you face is going to be horrific. And governments have been responding to that. Again, Australia and New Zealand have done extremely well. In the United States, my own country, recently in particular, states and localities have been alert to the keen importance of social norms and have signaled not you're going to be fined if you don't wear a mask, or you're going to be fined if you open your store. But this is what everyone else is doing. Don't you want to join them and be a member of your community? These are small things, but in aggregate, they can produce very large effects. Not only that, they have. So in nations, Taiwan's another example where they're really alert to the behavioral framework. I can say a little bit about what it concretely entails, but they've been very alert to it in Taiwan, and some of their good results are a direct outgrowth of behavior change, smart behavior change.
I mean, I certainly noticed the issue around social norms before we went into lockdown, really quite early on in the pandemic. I saw somebody wearing a mask on the train. I remember thinking to myself, "Oh gosh, that's a bit strange. I wouldn't do that." Whereas now, of course, a few months on, this is now much more of a social norm and much easier to do. So I think we can all relate to that. How do you see the kind of role of nudging within, I suppose, the armory of the policymaker, especially when they're currently faced with something that is so life and death as a pandemic? Isn't their instinctive response to reach for regulation and law? Because this matters so much, we couldn't just leave it to something as sort of amorphous as a nudge. But how does it all fit together?
Okay, think, if you would, of policies that familiarly involve mandates, like don't commit violent crime or don't sexually harass people. Some of the mandates may be accompanied by criminal penalties, some may be accompanied by civil penalties. In the context of violent crime and sexual harassment, we know, particularly for the latter, that if all we relied on was the mandate itself, we'd have, a crazy amount, as we sometimes have had, of sexual harassment and violent crime. So in both of those contexts, if we want to reduce the incidence, we need to complement the prohibition and enforcement of the prohibition with nudges. Now, they can take the form of, pretty stern warnings, or they can take the form of efforts to inculcate values of a certain kind, which hopefully will be part of a democratic process rather than a top-down imposition. But some of the progress we've seen in communities that have seen big decreases in violent crime and sexual harassment, it's been driven largely by nudges, where people are given a framework, maybe by reference to social norm, maybe by reference to just triggering a sense of conscience and what a good person does, maybe by a sense of triggering a sense of empathy with people who could be hurt. And these are not, you do this and you're going to have to pay a fine or you might face a jail sentence. They're instead, this is what we do here. And that notion of what we do here, this is what we do here, is just consistent with what you said about masks, where in the easily remembered past, if you wore a mask, it was a signal, I'm sick or I'm a terrified person. Now it doesn't have either of those signals. It's just that is what one does. So for nations that are drawn to mandates and bans, and surely they have an important role to play, to complement them with nudges is a really good idea. And in places like Denmark and the United States right now, and there are countless others which are opening up a bit, and so the prohibitions are weakened, to have simultaneous nudges is essential. And the word nudges is it's a small word, it's just something little, but we have cases where nudges are producing thousands or even millions of changes in behavior. And that's exactly what the world needs with respect to public health today.
Absolutely, and I can see that the cumulative effect of some of these small changes may be very, very major. One of the things that was certainly within the UK, there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether the public would stay in lockdown or whether they would tire of it and suffer some kind of behavioural fatigue. And in retrospect, it looks as if public compliance has been better than perhaps many people had predicted. So what do you think we could learn from, this episode?
I think the word behavioral fatigue is one to be very cautious about. Think of brushing your teeth, where many people do it every day and they don't feel, I'm tired of brushing my teeth. They feel that's what they do. Or of engaging in eating behavior. It's an elaborate word for lunch, breakfast, dinner. And people don't get tired. Maybe they do, but generally lunch, breakfast, dinner is a habit. So what I think is important for COVID-19 is to notice that the flip side of behavioral fatigue is habit creation. And that's, I think, a more robust phenomenon than behavioral fatigue if the underlying behavior is one that it is relatively easy to make customary in your life. And the idea of wearing a mask every day, like the idea of bringing out an umbrella when it's raining, it's it's raining, umbrella. That's what the mask is. That doesn't seem fatiguing. That just seems either what one does or safe. It's raining a lot. So I wouldn't worry terribly much about behavioral fatigue. If a nation is closed down in a way that doesn't fit with the data and is causing severe economic stress, that's self-evidently a problem. It's not behavioral fatigue. It's how am I going to get through my year? A different point.
Yeah, and I suppose that I think the point about habits is very powerful. And I suppose the interesting question will be how this has played out with different kinds of groups. So for somebody like me that can relatively easily work from home, I've created new habits and this is working pretty well. But if you're stuck, I suppose, in a relatively small flat with no outdoor space and you've got young children, it may not be possible to create a habit, and therefore that becomes more difficult.
Yes, and it's kind of incumbent on nations to attend to the distributional point, which you're signaling, where the reason some groups may face more hardship than others could be purely economic. It could be just physical. small space, or it could be kids. And these aren't things that can be solved on a dime, but the problems can be reduced pretty quickly through financial support, through accommodations of various kinds that help people with kids. And that is, there's an underlying unfairness that's very severe, but there's also a spotlight on the unfairness, which creates an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has certainly revealed again a whole series of inequalities which were for some people lying beneath the surface. What surprised you most about human behavior during this period?
The extraordinary speed of adaptation by people of wildly diverse situations. So we've seen, and this is inspiring, we've seen people who are, kind of self-important and wealthy, who are not poor, but they're staying at home and they're not going into work, who about whom it might have been said, good luck with that. And there are people who are really struggling, single parents who are staying at home and doing an amazing job with their family and often with their work from home. There are emergency room doctors. I have some friends who are emergency room doctors who are not saying at the height of this, at the height of the pandemic, and it's pretty bad now, but it was worse where I am a couple of months ago, who were saying, we are raring to go. This is what we trained for. Let's go. These are emergency room doctors who are surrounded by really sick people. The attitude is, this is what we're on the planet for. And it wasn't with despair. It was with a kind of passion for saving people. And to see that, the diversity of people who are doing that, it's something about the human spirit. But in terms of predictions from behavioral science, the diversity and rapidity of it is a surprise.
Yeah. Now, turning to the second part of the kind of name we've given our session, we talked about nudge and sludge. Sludge might be a term that fewer of the people who've tuned in today may be familiar with in this context of behavioral psychology, but it's increasingly being used. So can you explain the term and give us some examples?
Okay, so the basic idea is that human life is pervaded by frictions and paperwork burdens or administrative burdens, which are imposed sometimes in order to torment people and drive them crazy. And that is a successful project sometimes. Sometimes they're imposed by self-interest. So if you want to subscribe to something online, sometimes that's really easy. But to unsubscribe, you have to navigate sludge, meaning you have to talk to somebody. You have to answer 13 emails. You have to say something about exactly why you don't want to subscribe anymore. And by the time that question has been asked 4 times, you might say, okay, I'll keep subscribing. It's not that bad. That's sludge. So think of it as friction. It can be waiting time. So very recently in my country, voting in Georgia required 4 to 7 hours of waiting time. That's terrible sludge. It might be waiting time on the phone. It might be a requirement of an interview. It might be that you have to fill out some forms to get an occupational license. It may be you have to deal with the authorities in a way that is Kafkaesque in order to avoid something bad happening to you, which might be a fine or a really not good encounter with the criminal authorities. So think of it as a full universe of frictions that sometimes come from the telephone company, sometimes come from a utility company, sometimes come from public officials. And there's too much of it.
Right. And you've spoken positively about how some public officials around the world have been working hard to get rid of sludge. I mean, can you say a bit about what you're seeing? I mean, in particular, it'd be interesting to hear UK examples if you have any, but any from around the world of success in desludgifying.
Okay, so what we've seen is an unnamed war on sludge. And I'd want to study the UK situation carefully before calling out examples, but I'll give you the feel of examples, and I'm sure there are UK equivalents, where to get certain kinds of benefits, people have to go in for an interview. That's eliminated. Hospitals and doctors have reporting and paperwork requirements in order to do things that are being waived. There are requirements that poor people have to meet, sometimes every month, sometimes every 6 months, in order to get benefits to which they are normally entitled. Those are being reduced. There are benefits that governments are providing, specifically in the context of COVID-19, that would ordinarily have sludge associated with it, maybe an application requirement. And some countries, including Canada prominently, and in one context, the United States, so we have North American examples, they don't make you apply at all. They just send the stuff to you. It's going to be in your bank account because the government knows you're entitled to it. And it may seem like a small thing, but in a period in which people's health and economic situations are extremely fragile, the burdens imposed by sludge in terms of the costs are really high compared to, let's say, 6 months ago. And a somewhat more subtle and I think, more crucial point all over the world is that all of us have limited mental bandwidth. Our ability to do the 50 things that we're supposed to do today, we just don't have that. Maybe we'll get through 21 of them. In a period of pandemic, for many people, the cognitive bandwidth is just even less. They're dealing with their kids, they're dealing with economic fear, they're dealing with their employer. Some have had an increase in bandwidth, but many have had less. Insofar as we're talking about populations that are elderly, that have a mental health issue, that are dealing with economic terribleness, poor people, the bandwidth problem is very, very severe. And then sludge can be literally a killer. It can be metaphorically a killer, but literally a killer. And governments, in a kind of bottom-up way, this isn't, so far as I'm aware, in any country, a directive from a prime minister or the president, though I hope that's coming in a hurry. If anyone listening can make that happen, that would be a gift to help make it happen. A sludge reduction directive from the prime minister or the president would be a terrific thing to see. It saves time, which is the most precious thing that people have. It gives them access to things often that can turn their lives around. And this is a period in which we need more of that.
I mean, there's an interesting point that rises from that. The de-sludging agenda sounds similar to the casual ear, although I think it's different to the kind of deregulatory agenda. I think they're motivated probably by slightly different things and might take you to slightly different places, but one could imagine a government confusing the two. Do you just want to clarify the distinction between them or where they do overlap?
Right. So the deregulatory agenda, I think, on reflection, is something we should be ambivalent about. Not negative, but ambivalent about. I'll give you some data that will capture the point. The Trump administration has had imposed the lowest costs of any administration annually on the kind of standard accounting of any administration for which we have numbers. It only goes back to about 2000, but that's 20 years. So that's good. The Trump administration also has had the lowest benefits from regulation of any administration going back 20 years. And if you subtract benefits minus costs, which is what you want, that's the net benefits, the record of the Trump administration has been the worst. And the deregulatory action, deserves approval insofar as it's cost reduction. That can spur economic growth. It can take costs away from consumers and workers. So not negative, ambivalent about the deregulatory agenda. But if we're talking about taking away things that make air clean or that make workers safe or that get resources in the hands of people who A, need them and B, deserve them, then that's not good deregulation. To make particulate matter as a very bad air pollutant, to increase levels of particulate matter in the air, is to kill significant numbers of people. And that actually is interacting right now in a not ideal way with COVID-19. So deregulatory agenda, yes, when the costs of regulation exceed the benefits. More regulation, yes, when the benefits of regulation exceed the costs. In the context of sludge, we could, for just simplicity, define it as excessive frictions, in which case we want to get rid of all excessive frictions. And so that would be a good agenda. Or we could define it more neutrally as frictions, and then the ones we'd want to get rid of are the ones that are excessive, which wouldn't be a deregulatory agenda. It would be a sludge audit agenda. So what we're seeing, mostly in informal ways, but it's just starting in companies as well as in governments, is more formal sludge audits, where there's an accounting, how much sludge do we impose, and is it in the end justified by the legitimate goals that sometimes animate sludge, like making sure people who get benefits are eligible for them, or keeping good records to make sure that a program is working. Those are good reasons for sludge. But do we have 200% of the amount of sludge we need to accomplish those goals? If so, we can cut the sludge in half.
Thank you. We've got about 300 people tuned in at the moment. So for those regulatory geeks amongst you, I hope you enjoyed that exposition.
Regulatory, we call them regulatory aficionados. Geeks would be a kind of nudge not to be one. Sure. Aficionados isn't the best. Regulatory heroes, that's what we call you.
Cass, since you co-authored Nudge in 2008, one of the big changes has been the huge rise in social media. And so what's the impact of that in terms of the communications side of Nudge and Sludge?
It's a great question. So some of the social media platforms are very good at sludge reduction. Facebook has an initiative about helping people on their birthday to give money to charities and helping them encourage their friends. And I participated in this, and it's almost sludge free. It's so easy. And the Facebook designers are obviously alert to the behavioral finding that if you make something easy, sometimes the results will be spectacularly large in size. So some social media providers are using nudges constructively to benefit both donors and donees. The recent controversy over Twitter's signaling that a tweet from President Trump was, I think the word was potentially misleading. It's just a nudge. So what Twitter did was to say, to get the facts on this issue, go here. It's just a nudge, no ban. So we're seeing very agile uses of social media architecture to nudge people in various directions. Some of these aren't, clearly in the public interest. So insofar as people are nudged to see things that are basically louder echoes of their own voice, that's probably not the best thing for democracy. It may be worse than that. And if people are being nudged, and this isn't social media platforms, but it's a lot of website designers are using behavioral principles in a fiendish way. It's called dark patterns, automatically to enroll people in programs that they didn't clearly consent to, or pressing them repeatedly to buy a product that they have no interest in, knowing that if they keep being pressed on it, they'll eventually give up, or using social norms in a way that is in the economic self-interest of the seller and not clearly in any way in the interest of the buyer. And those aren't things, so far as I'm aware, that the social media providers are doing themselves, though they are doing some things that are very much in their interest to attract clicks. But they are nudging people, what I'm talking about, nudging people to part with their money. And that's not so good. Especially not good is automatic enrollment in things that mean people will be for years potentially giving their credit card to someone for some service that they don't use at all. I think all of us need to think much harder about the social media platforms' responsibilities. And this is a cliche. I'm going to try to make it a little more concrete, both to promote public health and to make democracies work better. and for the community standards that are used by, say, Twitter and Facebook to be revisited, let's say tonight, like in an hour, to think about nudges and sludge and how it's affecting public health, including through misleading or false statements. That would be a good idea.
Yeah. Thanks. That's fascinating. And turning back to something you raised earlier, which is the speed of change we saw in human behavior as being something that you found surprising. I mean, thinking about other big global challenges we face, I mean, notably climate change, what could we learn from how behavior has changed in the pandemic and what that might mean for what we could do for other global challenges?
It's a great question. And one way in, okay, so in the White House where I worked, the president had a phrase, admire the problem. And he said, meanwhile, back at the problem, meaning think of solutions. I'm going to admire the problem for a moment, and then I'll try to be meanwhile, back at the problem. So for climate change, it's different from the pandemic in the sense that the sense of immediate threat for many people just isn't there. So as we recently saw in Paris, if there's a tax, even a relatively modest tax, people might think, what are you doing here? Whereas if people are told something much more, severe, you have to stay home, people say, okay. And that's because death and illness concentrate the mind, and climate change has more abstraction. Okay, so that's a difference. One thing that recent data shows is working in Germany, that's behavioral, is that companies, I think, with the something like approval or spurring of Chancellor Merkel, they are automatically enrolling people in green energy, solar and wind. And people can opt out if they want. If they want to use coal, they can. And in some places, coal is cheaper. But automatically, you're in the climate-friendly energy source. And the recent data shows that's been a spectacularly effective policy, that people all over this large and important country are in green energy, just because that's been the nudge. I think they think, it's just not worth it to opt out, or I'd feel like a creep if I opted out. In any case, the policy is working. Not every country can do that, but lots and lots of countries can. For climate change, the basic idea out of that little story from Germany is if you can make the climate-friendly options easy, then people are more likely to choose them. If it's confusing or hard to figure out how to do something that makes your climate imprint smaller, then people are busy, they're not going to do it. So we need to think hard about that. And I think with special reference to the large entities like power plants or automobiles manufacturers, who are the main contributors. For automobiles, consumers are acting in response to nudges like fuel economy information in a way that's not enough, but that's something, and that is helping spur a more climate-friendly fleet.
And that's a great example about the opting in, opting out of your energy supplier, as it were. I mean, it emulates what is probably the best known nudge of all, which is around pension schemes and getting people enrolled in and having to opt out if they want to opt out. So that's a fascinating one I hadn't come across. But a final question from me before we take the Q&A coming in from our virtual audience is, looking a little bit ahead, it's clear that we're going to face a whole series of new challenges as we're coming out of the pandemic. I mean, the economy looms large. In the UK, we're likely to face a rise in unemployment, something we've not seen really for a very long time, but also changes in the patterns that we live and work. And what's your advice to leaders when they're starting to think about how to apply a behavioral science lens to the future challenges that are coming down the track? What should they be thinking about?
That's a large as well as great question. So I have two ideas. One is in deciding what policy to choose, to think in the most disciplined possible way about the consequences for human welfare. Now, that's an abstraction. I want to make a plea for cost-benefit analysis. There aren't banners under which people march saying cost-benefit analysis now, but it's the best way we have of being really careful about what the human impacts of our policies are. So the basic idea is, if you're deciding whether to go to one phase or another, to get the most concrete information about the incremental health harm, if there is one, and the incremental economic gain, and to just be measuring it versus alternatives. And if this isn't bringing smiles to people's faces, I can say in the US government, when I worked there, when things went well rather than less well, it was because this happened. And it resulted in, a lot of lives saved or a lot of economic distress being averted. So the staring at numbers, I'm not going to write a book called Staring at Numbers because no one would buy it, but that would be advice for public officials. Try to stare at some numbers. The second is to keep a little framework in mind, and this is an adaptation of a framework used by the UK's amazing behavioural insights team, and the framework is called FEAST. I'll tell you the east part of the framework, which is easy, make it attractive. If there's signage or if there's an opportunity, make it attractive. S is social, use social norms, kind of try to help nudge social norms in a certain direction. And T is timely, where the idea is if you tell people, at night, keep 6 feet apart when you go to the grocery store, good luck with that. If you could tell them when they go to the grocery store, keep 6 feet apart, that's the right time to do it. My little amendment is the word F for feast, and F stands for fun. And in New Zealand, the Prime Minister has been amazingly good at injecting an element of fun into the COVID-19 response. Who would have thought that was possible? But she said, we're going to have a big lockdown, but the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy are being exempted. They're getting an exemption. And she did it with a kind of delight and wit that helped people see they're in a situation that isn't great. It's scary, but we're all going to get over it. We're going to be laughing all the way. I just learned, at least we're going to be laughing as much as we can. If people are dying, you're not going to laugh. But as much as we can, we're going to retain that human capacity. I just learned yesterday that in Thailand, the word fun, in Taiwan, Thailand, I hope, Taiwan, I know, the word fun is part of the official framework for how to deal with the problem. And the FEAST framework is designed to say to public officials, human beings need, especially in the context of a serious challenge, to enjoy their lives. And, people are doing that.
Thank you. That's a great insight. I'm going to turn to questions now that we've been getting in from the audience. The first one is from Justin Parkinson from the BBC, who's asked that the government here has recently changed its main coronavirus message in England from stay at home to stay alert. And that's been criticised as vague. So does it work as a nudge?
I hope they're rethinking stay alert. So I have a great deal of admiration for many people in the UK government, and the behavioural insights team are my friends and colleagues. Stay alert, the question is completely right. It's too vague. It's like, be smart. To help people, you need to give them something like a GPS. Stay at home is that. It's not indicated anymore, but we need some equivalent to that.
Would you have a suggestion for something better?
Well, I have a direction, not a specific, because I'm not sure what's meant by stay alert. If the advice has to be actionable. And stay alert, maybe there's a certain percentage of the population that is just going through life like a dog I once knew, meaning not alert, a lovely dog, but not alert dog. But if you're doing that, probably being told to stay alert isn't going to have a big impact. Something like that would be stay safe. might have enough connotations. Sorry about that.
That's the UK government on the line.
The UK government is saying, "Why are you objecting to our slogan?" So the basic idea is something that maps onto something that people already has in their mind that is concrete. So stay safe is better than stay alert, or be kind. The New Zealand idea is better than stay alert because it calls up some particular associations. I want to know, if I were working there, what do you want people to do actually? And then you'll get some answers that can lead to a verbal formulation.
Very good, thank you. We've got a few questions which are around this kind of cluster of an idea that how do we hold the nudges to account if we're not aware about what they're doing? And this is mentioned in a couple of different contexts. Well, one person asking about in autocratic societies, another person is asking about how political parties are using nudges. So could you talk about that sort of in that sort of broad idea?
Great. So for governments, we need a Bill of Rights for nudging. And I actually have studied public opinion in 17 countries, including the UK and the United States and Russia and China and South Korea and Denmark, France. And there's something surprisingly like a consensus, not quite that, but close to that, on what rights operate as a check on nudges. And what emerges from this is if the government has illicit or self-serving motives, it's violating kind of the morality that all governments should have to respect. If the government is nudging people in a way that's inconsistent with their interests or values, people rebel against that in diverse countries. If the government is manipulating people, for example, with subliminal advertising, people don't like that very much. If the government is showing religious or racial favoritism through nudges, or even party favoritism for nudges, people don't like that either. And what's maybe just short of thrilling in this data is that in countries that have very different systems, we see a lot of agreement about what's not acceptable. And to kind of import that as a series of constraints on what governments can do. Transparency also, and maybe an opportunity for public input before a nudge is chosen is a really good idea. In the Obama administration, we did that, not because we were anything other than pragmatic, which is we might not know what we're doing, or people might hate it. And both of those would be good to know. And maybe people have ideas about something that's better, or about why this wouldn't be a good initiative. And plenty of times we learned from the public that we weren't going in the best direction, and they helped us devise a better nudge. I'll give you a couple examples. Fuel economy labels and calorie labels. The public was extremely informative about exactly what it made sense to do.
That's really interesting because, in a sense, sometimes the criticism of nudge is it's a very technocratic approach. It doesn't involve the people. It's really just a bunch of officials deciding what's good for you. But the sort of examples you're giving there are about some kind of partnership with the public, but then designing a kind of policy instrument that flows from public will in some way.
There's a lot there. So if I were to identify the most technocratic approaches, I think I'd put high on the list mercury regulation, ozone regulation, and regulate chemicals that are potentially dangerous and carcinogenic. That these are extremely technocratic judgments that entail use of expertise, and it's not really accessible to people who aren't trained, or not easily accessible. So I wouldn't put nudges at the top of the list of the technocratic. So if you go to, there used to be a time when there were these things called airports. I don't know if you remember them. And actually these big metal things would go up in the air and you'd all sit close to each other. But if you go to Heathrow, there are nudges everywhere telling you, where the bathroom is and how to get to your gate and where the rental cars are. And there might even be things on, haven't been to Heathrow very recently, so I don't remember if there are little steps that kind of direct you step by step how to walk to various places. Many airports have those things. They're really helpful. They're not technocratic.
We've got a couple of questions around how we get governments to take up a nudge approach. So somebody's asked, it's clear that there are some governments that have already really adopted this, but how do we get the others who are not really thinking about this to take it on? And another related question, which was very nicely phrased, which is how do we nudge towards sludge audits? How do we make those easy, as it were?
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you with whom we're speaking have connections with France, but France, is a country with such the words fail, of such an inspiring history in so many ways, and just nudging isn't coming there. And they could do so much on the cheap to help their people, and we're just not seeing much. I'm not sure why. The best inspiration for doing nudging is a track record of success. So when I was in the US government in 2009, if I said, I co-authored this book on nudging, let's do that, I think people would have said, well, we have a place you should go, and it isn't Washington, D.C. Not hell, but back to the private sector. Don't talk to us about abstractions. Talk to us about problems. So if the question is, how can you help people save for retirement, the example you gave, or if the question is, what can we do about climate change, or what can we do about H1N1? That was something I was engaged in that has some parallels to COVID-19. They're the behavioral science. It's relevant to all of those. So if it's problem-centered rather than theory-centered, and if it's driven by things that actually can be shown to work. David Halpern in the UK has been extremely successful in drawing attention to solving problems rather than to academic theories. We've seen a burst of activity in the last months and also in the last years with respect to use of nudges. I think in a way it's just going to happen as people who know how to do this work end up in government and old enough to be hired. Some of them are being trained in economics departments or psychology departments or somewhere. But in terms of getting it there in countries that aren't there, to get somebody excited. And if it's the prime minister, fantastic. If it's someone who's a minister, that's also really good.
Great. We've got a series of questions, I think, around, in a sense, connecting back to this question of democracy and nudges. One is about how do we make nudging more democratic? You talked a little bit about that, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that more. And then somebody else had also asked, does nudging work equally well when people know that they're being nudged?
The second one is great, and we have data which shows so far that every tested nudge is actually at least as effective when people know they're being nudged, and sometimes more effective when people know they're being nudged. And I think on reflection, that's not that surprising, because nudges aren't hidden. If you're given a calorie label, it's not a secret. You go to the Subway or the McDonald's and there's calorie labels there. So you're being nudged. Or if you buy a car and there's a label on it that tells you something about the fuel economy, or a refrigerator that tells you about the energy efficiency, you don't not know you're being nudged. In cases in which there's kind of very clear disclosure that people are being nudged, people either don't care or they think, oh, there must be a really good reason for it. I'll do it. So if people are told, the reason you've been enrolled in a pension plan is that this will ensure a larger accumulation of savings when you're older, unless you don't want that, if you opt out, then you'll have more money now and less money then. And we're making it so it's really easy for you to save for retirement, but you don't have to. That one particularly, to my knowledge, hasn't been tested in a rigorous way, but it's very possible to think people think, oh, I better do this. It seems like a really good idea. So to give people transparency about their being nudged is important. It's respectful. And it's part of the underlying ethics of nudging, which is preserving freedom of choice. Clarity that they're being nudged, then their freedom of choice isn't full. GPS nudges you, and that doesn't make it less effective. If anything, it makes it more effective. So too with a sign on a beach that says, warning, you probably shouldn't swim today because the waves are pretty terrible. In terms of the democratic, that's a really great question. And I mentioned calorie labels. So I'll say a little bit about that. That actually the requirement came from a law which was enacted by our legislature. And then the question was how to implement it. And there are ways to implement calorie labels that can have more or less aggressiveness and more or less range. So do you include movie theaters? The law isn't clear on that. And the way the US government tried to figure it out is it said, here's our proposal. Here are 5 alternatives. I'm making that number 5 up, by the way. I think it was more than that. 5 alternative things in terms of presentation or in terms of scope. And we want to hear your comments. And it was a lengthy process of obtaining comments. And many of the comments suggested the proposal wasn't a good one. And some of them were completely convincing. And so we ended up doing something different. And what's true for democracy and nudging is, I hope, going to be even more true for democracy and mandates, because mandates are the more threatening because they don't allow people to opt out. So there's an openness to a nudge, which creates a safeguard against government mistake or corruption or whatever, self-interest. But since nudges are impactful, we need these safeguards of democratic engagement.
I think it's a powerful point you make, which is sometimes forgotten, which is that the nudging architecture is all about allowing people choice. I mean, it nudges, but it does. I mean, I think the formal term you used originally was liberal paternalism. It's got a liberal element as well as a paternal element, and we must.
The kind of American term is libertarian paternalism, because liberal kind of means left of center. So think of it as freedom preserving, and that's humility that government officials need to be alert to the fact that they may get it wrong.
Yeah. Now, a fascinating question that's come in, and a difficult one, is what does nudging have to say about the way that certain public debates are getting more and more polarized at the moment? I mean, we see this in particular in the way that social media spheres operate, but we can see that, I think, particularly in the US at the moment. Does nudge give any insight on that?
Well, behavioral science does. So I'll tell you a little experiment I was involved in a few years ago, where we got a bunch of people who were left of center to talk about an international treaty on climate change and to talk with each other about whether there should be one. And we asked them to record their views privately and anonymously before they talk to each other, and privately and anonymously after they talk to each other. And we also did that for people who are right of center, that they only talked with like-minded others. But in both groups, there was diversity going in on an international treaty to control climate change. And what happened was the people who were left of center ended up more extreme, more confident, and more unified. They went whoosh to the left on climate change. On the right, there was some diversity before they started to talk. In their anonymous post-deliberation statements of opinion, they went whoosh to the right. They all thought that the international agreement, crazy idea. They all thought that. It was unanimous, and it wasn't going in. So social media were observing the Colorado experiment. There are often, not always by any means, but often echo chambers by which people are sorting themselves into like-minded groups, and they end up more extreme. Now, Facebook on its news feed can aggravate that problem or reduce that problem. It can encourage people just to hear their own voice, or it can nudge people to hear diversity of voices. Regrettably, Facebook hasn't gone in the, let's say, ideal direction from the standpoint of democracy, though they've been worrying over the problem, they've been admiring the problem, but meanwhile back at the problem. So there can be nudges that would help by having some clarity in your news feed about the diverse voices that are out there, or something that would give you a sense that what you're reading right now is actually false. And Facebook has taken some steps in that direction, so has Twitter, but let's say more can be done.
Great. We're getting close to the end of our time, but a kind of final set of questions, I think, cluster around this idea of how do we make sure that some of the successes we've had around nudging during this early stage of the pandemic continue through as we now start emerging out of lockdown? I mean, a couple of people make the point that actually there are more people who've now had the infection, but we seem to be kind of relaxing almost at the same time. I'm sure that's not, different pictures in different countries, but what's your prognosis of how we should be using nudge in this, what might be quite a dangerous period?
Yes, there's suggestive data. It's not, airtight yet, but it's suggestive data that if you tell people, if you take precautions, you will reduce risk to yourself. That's helpful. But if you tell them if you take precautions, you're less likely to endanger your friends and neighbors, that has a bigger impact. So New Zealand has been masterful at giving people sense that, sensible precautions, let's call them, are a way to ensure that you yourself are not responsible for the illness of another member of the human species. And there are ways of doing this that are unpleasantly directive and sanctimonious, to do it instead with a sense of common endeavor and good cheer. Um, the kind of record of success in multiple countries over the last months suggests that's something to build on.
Thank you very much. Well, look, Cass, we will end there. I'd really like to thank you for all of the time that you've given us today. It's been fascinating insights on how we can respond to the pandemic in general, but we've strayed well beyond that as well to think about, the role in democracy, social media, and preventing kind of more authoritarian uses of nudge as well. So it's been fantastic. I'd like to thank our virtual audience as well, most of whom have stayed with us through the course of an hour. And of course, we've been recording this, so many more people will be able to hear it as we go into the future. For those of you who are still with us, do keep an eye on the British Academy website and our social media. You'll be able to see more from our Shape the Future work, which is responding to COVID, and our future events. But for now, I'd like to thank all of you, and thank you again, Cass.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.